Kia ora. Welcome to Conversations with Wāhine, brought to you by the Wellington branch of the National Council of Women, New Zealand.
Hello and welcome to Conversations with Wāhine. Today you've got me, Harita, and I'm joined with Hayley. How are you, Hayley?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Today we've got a Greens MP, Eugenie Sage. She's been a Green MP since 2011. She chairs Parliament's Environment Select Committee and was Minister of Conservation, Minister for Land Information, and Associate Environment Minister of Waste from October 2017 to October 2020. She's currently the Greens spokesperson for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries, Conservation, Forestry, Land Information, Emergency Management and Three Waters. Welcome, Eugenie. How are you?
Kia ora. Well, thank you.
So first things first, initially you never intended to be an MP, but what led you down the route of starting in politics and the Greens Party in particular?
So I had worked for about 13 years for one of Aotearoa's leading conservation organisations, Forest and Bird, and had done a lot of advocacy to district councils, regional councils, sometimes select committee, and had wanted to be on the other side of the table, making some of the decisions instead of always seeking them. So stood for Environment Canterbury in 2007, was elected. But Rodney Hyde and Dr. Nick Smith got rid of elected regional councillors. They wanted a more compliant council that was more pro-irrigation. And so that was in April 2010, and had been in touch with late Rod Donald and Jeanette Fitzsimons as while working with Forest and Bird on some of the campaigns we were running in the high country to protect West Coast forests. And it was the Green Party ethos which really accorded with my values, particularly the commitment to justice for nature and for people.
Very interesting. It's cool to see what you've done with it now. And Harita and I both went to your valedictory celebration afterwards, and it was really beautiful because you could see just how many people you had impacted throughout your time. It was lovely to see and be a part of.
Thank you for coming. And I guess it was with Jan Logie, and so both Jan and I are standing down at the selection. So that leaves Julianne Genter. It's one of our colleagues who came in 2011 as well. So she's the only remaining MP from that cohort.
Yeah, she's great. She was great to chat to, actually. We had a pretty good chat with her in the studio not too long ago. Some might say that being in a smaller party, it does mean more responsibility as each person has to cover more portfolios. As a Green spokesperson for 9 of them, how would you juggle your time in between these? And how do you make sure that they can get your full attention?
You're right. It does give you more responsibility across a range of issues. And it is a case of being a bit of a grasshopper, jumping from one to another. But it is also trying to prioritise issues. And this term have really prioritised oceans with our team at Parliament to just highlight the importance of oceans, particularly with climate change and the fact that oceans have taken 90% of the heat from a changing climate, a lot of the CO2, the carbon as well. So some portfolios get more attention at one time and then others more attention later on. It also depends what bills are before the Parliament, what issues are before Select Committee, and where you think you can make the most difference.
Okay, what kind of pros and cons do you think there are to being a smaller party?
We would like to grow our vote, and in the election, and I know this isn't going to be broadcast before the election, but we look as if we are going to get a good range of support, and I hope more MPs. When I came in 2011 with Julianne and Jan and Denise Roche and Mojo Mathers and others, we had 14 MPs, and we had 14 again in 2014, but this term we started with 10 and we now have 9. So I hope that the election result grows the Green vote. It makes you more agile. It means we've got a much flatter structure. Everybody's involved in decision making, and that's a core part of the Green Party kaupapa. But we do want to get to be a bigger party. So really happy if our vote goes up and we get more MPs.
Yeah. Like you said, you're one of the longest serving MPs in the Green Party caucus, along with Julianne Genter and Jan Logie. You cite the Jobs for Nature program as one of the achievements that you've been involved with, which was a 1.2 billion program across multiple government agencies aimed at benefiting the environment, people, and the regions. It was part of the government's COVID-19 recovery package. Can you elaborate for our listeners a bit about what this program entails and why it's been such a positive change for New Zealand?
I think last term, when the Greens were in government, confidence and supply arrangement with Labor, we got the biggest ever increase in conservation funding in 16 years in budget 2018. That made an enormous difference because it provided secure funding for Te Papa Atawhai Department of Conservation to undertake aerial control. With a changing climate, we're getting more frequent beech mast years where there's more flowering in the beech and podocarp forests. So then mice and rat numbers go up because there's more for them to eat. And then stoat numbers go up because they've got more mice and rats to eat. And then once the beech seed has rotted away, the stoats and the rats turn to birds. And so that has an enormous impact on our wildlife. And so providing that secure funding for aerial control gives them a chance to breed successfully. So we got that in budget 2018 and that continued on. But then as part of COVID recovery, particularly when government was concerned about falling employment and the risk of a lot of job loss, the Jobs for Nature was conceived by the Greens, and really shout out to my colleague James Shaw. He was Associate Finance Minister last term, so he did a lot of the advocacy along with me, to fund people, particularly in regions, to do practical work in nature. We saw in places like Queenstown, Franz Josef, Fox Glacier, where tourism businesses were really hard hit with the borders being closed. And so Jobs for Nature allowed those people with really practical outdoor skills to work on things like track building, wild and conifer control, pest control. And it also allowed a whole lot of people who hadn't had a great deal of experience working outdoors, working for conservation, to get involved in giving nature a helping hand. And it's enabled community organisations, iwi and hapu, across the motu to get out and do practical work for nature in Whakaraupo, the Littleton Harbour Basin. It's quite a landscape which has been cleared, and there's a whole lot of planting that's been done to help reduce the sediment that is washed off the land, goes into streams and into the harbour, and then smothers marine life and wrecks the stream habitats. And so there's a huge environmental benefit there, as well as people having really worthwhile jobs. And for many, it's meant going on to do other work. And for community organisations, it's really, and iwi and hapu, really enabled them to expand their work with nature, trying to restore some of the biodiversity loss that we've had through 150 plus years of colonisation.
I love that detail. It's so cool just hearing about the biodiversity and how it all kind of works together, and how humans can have a helping hand and actually help fixing it.
A lot of the landholders, like the wild and conifer control, which the Labor-led government, with strong support from the Greens, increased the funding to control these wildings, often radiata pines, which are growing in the wrong place. And that helps protect the tussock grasslands. And a lot of the landowners in the high country have been really supportive of that too. So it's been, Jobs for Nature has allowed councils, iwi, hapu, community organisations, and the department to really work together. and Ministry for the Environment, Ministry of Primary Industries, and LINZ, Land Information New Zealand, they've all had programs too. DOC's had about 488 million through the program, but MFE has concentrated its projects, or the ones it administers, around waterways. So that's had an enormous benefit for protecting our waterways.
Yeah. Spanning out just from New Zealand and maybe towards the rest of the world a little bit, what are some of New Zealand's biggest environmental risks and threats currently? And how do you think this country is placed in comparison to the rest of the world, and also just countries that we normally try and compare ourselves to?
We have the twin crises, the climate crisis and the nature crisis. Because Aotearoa evolved in isolation the last 80 million years, we've been several islands distant from the big Gondwana supercontinent. We've got a lot of species that are endemic. They're only found here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so we're a biodiversity hotspot. And because of our history of burning, clearing, grazing, overgrazing, we have lost a huge amount of habitat, and we have 4,000 species that are threatened or at risk of extinction globally. There are about 1 million species. So if we lose species like the kakapo, the kiwi, a lot of our alpine flowers from Aotearoa, they're not found anywhere else in the world. So we really have to invest in protection. So that's one crisis. And then with the climate crisis, the impact that is having on biodiversity, it means pests are weeds are spreading from wind spread. The mast years that I mentioned before are becoming more common. And then we've had the huge impact of the climate on the ocean, the climate emissions on the ocean. So we're not doing at all well. 4,000 species threatened or at risk of extinction, but it's partly because we're a hotspot. But in terms of ocean protection, we only have less than 0.5% of the oceans around Aotearoa are protected, whereas countries overseas have done so much better, like 36%, I think, in places like the UK around their coast. And so we've got virtually all of our seas open to commercial exploitation, whether it's mining or commercial fishing. So we need to do better there. And we have got enormously effective people in predator control, but we need to fund conservation more. And I guess that's where I have major concerns with some of the other political parties that are proposing cuts across the public sector, because conservation, you always need more funding to give our native species a better chance. Because it's a core part of the green kaupapa that without a healthy environment, you can't have healthy people. For us to thrive, we need nature to be healthy. We need clean air, we need clean water, we need places where we can go and relax. And investing in nature is a way to keep us healthy as well as our species.
Yeah, that's really true. And that's a huge issue we've got right now, as well as many other countries in the world. And also on that note, what do you see as some of the other key issues in nature now, and also maybe over the next 5 to 10 years?
We've got a huge crisis with deer in our forests. We've seen with Cyclone Bola and Gabrielle a lot of slash and sediment loss, huge sediment covering paua, crayfish beds, or areas of crayfish habitat. And where you've got land that's forested, it's much better protected against storms, and the slopes are more stable. But within our forests, we've seen a massive increase in deer and goats. DOC's surveys are finding deer are much more prevalent than they were, say, even 10, 15 years ago. And they're not recognised as much of a problem as they should be. We need to have deer control because they eat out the understory and the forest collapses. And so we need deer, pigs, feral goats, these browsers, which were introduced to Aotearoa, we need to get them under control if our forests are to be healthy. We've got 1/3 of Aotearoa is conservation land. So we've got a real opportunity for the government to invest more. How we implement the treaty more effectively, we saw recently with the signing of the deed of agreement with Taranaki Maunga, Te Papakura o Taranaki, what was Egmont National Park, being renamed and moving into a new era of co-governance with the Taranaki iwi and the Crown. So it's how do we ensure that the treaty is properly implemented, and there's a huge potential on conservation land to do that. Fresh water is still a challenge. The dairy intensification is still leading to too much nitrate in our aquifers, rivers, and our oceans. So we've got challenges in all those spaces.
That's a lot of work.
But New Zealanders really care about this, because so many of us get out and find sort of well-being and get a respite from day-to-day life by getting out in nature. So it's a place of enormous sort of replenishment and nourishment, really.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you generally go about deer control? It's not an area I'm too familiar with, but I'm interested.
So back in the 1970s, there was a huge increase in deer numbers, and today we've got the Department of Internal Affairs and that deer plague to thank for the huge network of huts and tracks, particularly on the west coast of the South Island, because deer cullers were employed by government to go out and shoot deer. And so it would be by professional hunters, and there'd have to be discussions with the hunting hunting groups, but they like shooting bigger animals. And if you get the population exploding, the animals go hungry, and you're not getting the big stags that they like either. So we really do need much more public understanding of the threat of deer, along with feral goats and pigs. And everybody knows about possums, but deer are as much as a problem with their numbers increasing. So we've had this targeted control in the past, and we need to do something similar.
That's very interesting. You have been advocating for marine protection, as you said before. When so many New Zealanders do live close to the coast and enjoy naturally swimming, fishing, boating, and so forth, how are we doing in looking after our coasts and oceans?
It was great just last week. You had the Conservation Minister, Eugenie Prime, announcing new marine reserves off the southeast Otago coast. And last term, as Conservation Minister, I and Stuart Nash had pushed those along. We'd accepted the recommendations of a collaborative group. But that has taken almost 10 years to get those marine reserves established. So that's just too slow. And if we want thriving nature, given that our sea area that we're responsible is 15 times the size of our land mass, and we've got the 4th largest exclusive economic zone in the world, we've got a real responsibility to look after the oceans. But we have totally failed. Once we were a leader back in the 70s, we had one of the world's first marine reserves up at Okari Point, Cape Rodney Lee. And yet now the United States, the UK, a lot of the Pacific states are miles ahead of us in terms of marine protection. And when you have marine reserves, you get the fish getting bigger in size, they spawn more, there's much more diversity of marine life. And so we need more marine protected areas. We need a complete reform of the Marine Reserves Act, because that doesn't have a treaty basis. And as Kaitahu said last week, these new marine reserves, they'll be co-managing with government, and they are strongly supportive of marine protected area reform of the legislation. We started that last term when the Greens were in government, but that hasn't progressed in any obvious way in the last 3 years. So that's why if we get more Greens in government, they'll prioritise doing that. And last term, we did a big review of the Hector's dolphin and Maui dolphin threat management plan, and doubled the size of the marine mammal sanctuaries to protect the dolphins from trawl nets being caught up in those, and from seismic surveys and seabed mining. But we still catch hundreds of dolphins and seals each year in fishing nets or on fishing lines, thousands of seabirds, including albatross and petrel species, which are threatened with extinction. So the commercial fishing industry really needs to lift its game, and government needs to ensure that they are doing so much better and we are not harming protected species. The New Zealand sea lion is as threatened as the kakapo, and yet they can still be killed in the squid fishery in the Southern Ocean. So we have got a responsibility to fish without killing protected species. So we need to do so much better in the oceans.
Yeah, just in regards to the Maui dolphins, the extra protections that were brought in, did they have anything to do with the US court's ban on importing the fish?
Good question, Hayley. So we significantly, they're found on the west coast of the North Island, the Taranaki area, and we extended the sanctuary to the south, to Wellington. But the Sea Shepherd took a case in the United States, and their marine administration, NOAA, was not satisfied that we had done enough. That's why they banned some of our seafood imports, and so we need to do more. And the Greens have pushed for that this term, but we haven't been in a position because we haven't had those portfolios to implement them. So that court action was quite critical, and I think because consumers are really interested in the fact that their fish are sustainably caught and they're not killing other species, we may see more of those sorts of bans. So we need to do better. And the Greens have, alongside Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, Greenpeace and others, really pushed for a ban on bottom trawling, because we've got these underwater mountains which are got deep sea coral, which can be centuries old, sponges, a whole raft of species, and they're where some fish species like orange ruffy congregate to spawn, and yet you can drag these bottom trawl nets with heavy steel ropes and cables across them, and that completely smashes the corals to rubble. So it's our policy to ban bottom trawling on seamounts and other vulnerable marine ecosystems with areas like coral within the first 100 days or so of becoming, if we're in government, and then to phase it out across the rest of the sea.
I'll be interested to know your thoughts on what's happening regarding the Hauraki Gulf at the moment. Have you had much to do with that?
Yep, that was something again last term as Minister of Conservation. There was a collaborative group called Sea Change. They came out with a number of recommendations for protected areas, and I took that report off the shelf and then worked with Stuart Nash, and we set up a ministerial advisory group. They did some more recommendations. They reported just before the last 2020 election, and then this term, government has the Ministry of Fisheries or Fisheries New Zealand and DOC have worked to implement those recommendations far too slowly, and the government now introduced legislation, the Hauraki Gulf Te Kapa Moana Marine Protection Bill, just before Parliament ended. It's open for submissions, and that establishes these new protected areas. It does, it's proposed there are some controls on bottom trawling in the Gulf, but there's not a proposal for a complete ban, and the Green Party believes there should be a complete ban because it's one of our most important areas. It's a marine park, for goodness sake, and yet bottom trawling can continue.
Yeah, so that's what I was interested about when it comes to your opinion, because I know there is some questions as far as how far that ban should go.
Yeah, the fishing industry like bottom trawling because they say it's very efficient. They can catch lots of fish, but somewhere like the Hauraki Gulf, which is a marine park, which has got issues like current sewage discharges, sediment, we need, and which once had hundreds of square kilometres of mussels on the seabed and other filter feeders, which helped keep the water clean. And bottom trawling and dredging have destroyed those seabed habitats. And there's work underway to bring mussels from Coromandel, drop them over the side, and then they re-establish those seabed habitats. So we need to protect them from trawling. And the biggest area that's currently protected from trawling is where the cables come, the cable protection zone. So Chloe, I, and Ricardo were all out with Greenpeace and Forest and Bird when they did one of their big actions on the water with against bottom trawling. So one of the roles of the Green Party is often being the voice in Parliament to work alongside social justice and environmental movements and take those public concerns into the Parliament, question ministers, and seek legislative change too.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I guess, like, if you don't do it now, then it's only going to ruin the environmental cycle more and more, and then we're going to have to fix more issues in the future if nothing's done about it now.
Yeah, I mean, even in my lifetime, I can remember growing up in Tamaki Makaurau, and when you went out on the harbour, you could see these boil-ups with so many fish coming to the surface and then the seabirds feeding on them. But you don't get that now because there's been overfishing and the Gulf is not healthy. But there's efforts underway to restore it, and we can give it a helping hand by new marine protected areas and also ending bottom trawling. And we want controls, more stronger controls on earthworks on land, so you get less sediment going in.
So on a slightly related note, you've said in the past that we've got a rubbish record on waste. And it's reported that since the 1950s, over 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic have been produced, and half of that in the last 15 years alone. And scientists estimate that there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean by weight in 2050, which is not too far away. And the small margin of plastic that doesn't wind up in the landfill is often exported from high-income countries to developing countries to process. So what's involved in turning around New Zealand's rubbish record on waste and hopefully reversing the cycle of all the waste that we have in the oceans?
So it was a Green Party law change, the Waste Minimisation Act, it was a private member's bill by Nandor Tanchos, former Green MP, back in 2008. And there was very little done under the previous national government. So we really took that up last term when we were in government, and I was Associate Minister for the Environment, and started a whole work program on reducing waste. And one of the key issues was increasing the landfill levy. So if you send material to landfill, you have to pay more. And then all of that revenue is recycled back into minimising waste to community organisations, Para Kore, which is doing that on Maui, to councils for new infrastructure for recycling. So they increased the landfill levy, started work on mandatory product stewardship schemes. So, and the best one of those was going to be the container return scheme for beverage containers. So you would buy a drink, you'd pay a bit more, and when you returned that drink container, whether it was a can or a glass bottle or a plastic bottle, you'd get your deposit back. And that money would be used to help recover all the beverage containers and then ship them to reprocessing. Aluminium's really good to recycle, for example. But Labor delayed work on that in the policy bonfire earlier this year, unfortunately. But there's work underway for a scheme on tyres. It's just about completed for things like big electric batteries and electronic waste. And so that was the second initiative. Another was standardising curbside recycling, so that if you were in Auckland, the system would be the same as in Ōtautahi, because at the moment they're quite different systems. And moving also to get better labelling. So there's all these initiatives which the Labor government has continued under David Parker and then Rachel Brooking. So we kicked off a big work program on waste aiming to reduce waste to landfill. And then another key initiative of the government has been the emissions reduction plan and the waste strategy and commitments in that to ensure that no food waste goes to landfill after 2030, because food waste breaks down any organic waste, creates methane, greenhouse problem. So there are a number of community composting groups around the motu. Eden Park, for example, all of the food waste from Eden Park is composted on site. It's an amazing operation, community composting hub. And well, you think with the World Cup games recently, a lot of food waste there, but a really good partnership between Eden Park Management and a local community composting network. And so, and they also accept food waste from the local neighbourhood. So we need more of those sorts of ventures to ensure that we don't put food waste in landfill. So there's a whole lot of work that's been kicked off, and it's happening in different ways with councils and community organisations and iwi and haput as well.
Oh,
but we need to do so much more. But your point,
yeah.
Harita, about the export, Lydia Chai did a petition about that in terms of plastic waste being exported to Malaysia. There were changes to the Basel Convention, which meant that you needed to get any exporters needed the permission of the country they were exporting to. So that has been a good change. Lydia and others in Malaysia were arguing that it was still happening. But the more infrastructure we get in New Zealand to reprocess it, the less will be exported offshore. But we were irresponsible in doing those exports to countries that don't have as good environmental standards as ours.
I've seen over time, this is just a off-the-cuff question, there's been some really cool technologies coming up when it comes to essentially melting down weights in sciencey ways that I can't really explain. Is there anything happening like that that you're quite excited about right now?
I'm more worried. There have been various proposals for waste to energy. There's one in Waimate, which has just been called in and will be decided by the minister nationally. Waste to energy, where people think, oh, we'll just burn all this municipal waste and we'll create energy in the process. Then you need to feed the beast. So they encourage increased waste production rather than avoiding waste, which is what we want to do. The key thing is actually thinking about the stuff that we buy and consume. Do we need all the stuff that we have in our homes? Many of us who have more money, and just focusing on what we actually need. And is it repairable? We're also pushing for legislation that requires manufacturers to enable products to be repaired. Think about toasters. They generally last, a couple of years at most. Kettles, that sort of household electronic goods. So no, that waste to energy one I am concerned about, and Kaipara is proposing it. And we don't, at the moment we've got landfills, but waste to energy has been used overseas, and there's increasingly challenges to them because of the air pollution, because of the residue, which still needs to go to landfill, and because they provide an incentive to generate waste rather than reduce it. So I'm more excited, Ailey, about the range of jobs that can be created in reprocessing and recovering. One last term went out to Porirua, and a couple there had started picking up computers from around their neighbourhood and dismantling them and then recycling the componentry. Then they grew the business to 12, and then it got bought by another company, and we were opening their new premises, and they were employing 30 people. So that had gone from backyard computer dismantling to proper e-waste recycling. So, but we need to get manufacturers thinking about how they design things so that they can be dismantled or repaired, preferably, and then the parts reused. But there is more funding from the Waste Levy to help more businesses do that. So that's what's exciting, the potential to recover more materials and create more jobs, and ensuring that things are reprocessed, reassembled, and not go to landfill.
It's going to be really cool to see the inventive ways that people come up with to overcome these kind of bumps. I'm excited.
Yeah, and I think things like repair cafes, where people get together and learn skills, and then that builds community, and that makes communities more resilient when we're faced by the events of a changing climate. So that's what really excites me, the recognition that we can go back to the future and learn some of the skills like sewing, mending, how do you repair bikes, how do you repair clothes, making things last longer, so we get away from this sort of throw out mentality.
Oh, absolutely. I could complain about fast fashion for at least half an hour.
Yes,
I'll
yes.
move that on to Harita.
No, you need maybe interview someone about that Lucy Maid or yeah. There's really great initiatives happening there.
Absolutely.
Very true. So the Green Party lobbied against the controversial Three Waters legislation under the understanding that water should remain in public ownership, and passing this legislation could make water much easier to privatise. The Green Party's push to protect Three Waters assets from privatisation using a 60% majority threshold rather than 75% was an idea inspired by a university academic, Professor Andrew Geddes from Otago University Faculty of Law, who actually wound up leading the charge against it. We'd love to hear more detail on how this unfolded and why it's so important to steer clear of future governments privatising our water. Do you feel that establishing a 60% consensus in Parliament is a better way forward when determining a wider range of amendments and legislation?
I think Queenstown has shown us with the cryptosporidium there that we do need to change the way we manage water. And the Green Party's had quite a nuanced position on there about being sort of 4 separate pieces of legislation. We strongly supported the establishment of Aotearoa, which is the overall regulator, to ensure that councils at the moment and water services entities in future provide drinking water, wastewater and stormwater according to certain standards, because we can't afford people being worried about what comes out of the tap and whether it's going to make them sick. Everyone's got a right to clean drinking water. But some of the larger councils like Auckland and Watercare, that operates as a council-controlled organisation. It's of the scale, by supplying water to over about 1.2 million people, to be able to invest in the kit, the skills, the technology to ensure that water, drinking water, is safe. And through Auckland Council, it's meant that smaller councils like Rodney, which were absorbed into Auckland, their drinking water is significantly improved because it's been able to be afforded across the wider region. The current problems with sewage, I guess, are a result of underinvestment in the past and also the heavy rains with the Parnell problem. So we recognise the need for change, but we thought that setting up these entities, which were no longer owned directly by councils, was not the way to go. We would have preferred them to be larger in scale, and we supported the legislation which established 10 entities rather than 4. We thought 4 was too few, 10 was about the right number. And we think they should have been council-controlled organisations and there be a Crown guarantee for their borrowing, because if we're going to improve Three Waters, we need to invest more, and there was concern that that would lead to rates bills going too high. Our other concern, and one of the reasons we opposed the legislation, was stormwater needs to stay with councils, because it's councils that provide our parks, reserves, responsible for the streets, all of those where stormwater can be absorbed or a part of the overland flow. We need to be have spongy cities which absorb more water, not generate these huge volumes of runoff after intense weather events. And it's councils which do the planning and the placemaking. So that's why we thought stormwater should stay with councils, wastewater and drinking water should go to the entities. So that's why I have a nuanced position. And because you've got fewer entities, it would be easier for a future government to privatise because the decision making is more concentrated. And in the UK, you've seen water has been privatised there, and then there've been big problems with then the companies generating return for investors, and particularly in the London Thames area, having real financial problems. So that's why we pushed for stronger provisions to protect against privatisation. We highlighted that in our report on the bill at Select Committee, letter to the Minister, but the final stages were dealt with under urgency, and so the what's called a supplementary order paper went through under urgency, which wasn't desirable, but it was the only way that the legislation was being dealt with. So what's happened is that the Standing Orders Committee has recommended that if there is any provision in a bill which needs to be entrenched, which is where you have more than a 50% majority of Parliament required to change it, then that should only happen if it's considered at the select committee stage and people can make submissions. So that was a good change to the procedures, which ensures that there's more thorough consideration of entrenchment. But make no apology for standing up for public ownership of water and wanting stronger provisions around that. So the legislation has gone through, the entities are being established, and it remains to be seen as a result of the election, whoever's in government. If it's Labour and the Greens, then the entities will continue to be established, but if it's National, they've proposed repealing it, which then leads to about 4 or 5 years of more probably Queenstown. So that seems a very short-sighted approach, just completely repealing it. So we pushed for change, as we do as a Green Party on the way through. We did get some changes, and our lobbying as well as councils did help ensure that there were 10 rather than 4 entities, and that means that the community has a much stronger local voice in those entities.
Very interesting. The term spongy city just captivated me a little bit. Are you able to just elaborate a little bit more on what that means and the infrastructure that surrounds it?
Chloe Swarbrick and I visited Mark in Freeman's Bay, and Freeman's Bay, sort of hilly in that part of Auckland. You can see the Sky Tower from his property. He has planted his berms so that it's like walking through a subtropical forest and his garden. And what that has done is it means, because it's hilly, there's quite a lot of stormwater that flows down, but it slows the water, means the plants absorb it and the berms absorb it, and then you get less flooding downslope. So in the big anniversary weekend floods in Stonefields, big subdivision in the Mount Wellington Ellerslie area, that had got a series of sort of ponds, and there wasn't a flooding problem there, even though it's sort of in a bit of a depression. A big Aotearoa wetland that filled to the brim with water. It's the largest wetland in urban Auckland. And that's what we mean by sponge. Wetlands are nature's sponges, nature's kidneys. They absorb water and they clean it. So if we have more of these green areas within our city, we make it more resilient to climate change. And when Mark had done it in Freeman's Bay, it just made a much pleasanter streetscape too. Instead of just having grass or asphalt, you had all these plants around the base of the plane trees. And he'd created what was just a barren grassy park. He'd planted that up, and now it was a really pleasant area that people enjoyed being in. So it's putting nature back into our cities. More green space means we're more resilient to these much more intense weather events that we're getting with the changing climate. It's more places for kids to play, and it's just a pleasanter environment to be in. And when you have more plantings, more urban trees, it buffers the noise effects. It's cleaner. It's a place where kids can have swings and play, and habitat for bird life as well. So it just makes nicer cities.
Yeah, I actually had to apply for permission to my council to start planting plants in a similar fashion. I'm nowhere near there yet, but they've given me permission, so at least that's great. But it doesn't happen too often. I'm not sure if they say yes to a lot of people.
Well, I think Auckland Transport had raised questions with Mark, and Chloe has got a little video that's going, Chloe Swarbrick, on her social media about Mark's garden. It's going up shortly, it may even be up. So look for that. The sponge city concept is being promoted by a lot of people to move away just from having asphalt and concrete, which just means you get these massive flows of water that then need to be dealt with, to actually slowing it down, having ground plants absorb it, and it just helps the infrastructure work better. But yeah, so good on you, Hayley, for seeking permission from the council, and I think they've realised what Mark has done, that the potential of this, but it's the change in thinking to work with nature rather than against it.
Well, the really cool thing as well is after I started doing that, my neighbours across the road started doing it, and now theirs looks better than mine, so now I have to catch up. So
but that's what it takes, right? One person starts and then other people do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we're sharing initiatives like where you can get cheap mulch or how you can kind of look after each other. It creates a much cooler community atmosphere.
Yes, and then you're getting people out from behind their fences back into the street, and so the street becomes a place for shared experiences, not just a place for cars. So it's reclaiming the streets. So well done.
Thank you. I do enjoy it. Leading on from that, though, when speaking about the dairy industry and its effects on the quality of our water, you spoke of a future with more horticulture and niche industries such as hemp and merino fabric. From a purely financial perspective, does demand from industries such as these have the capacity to be as profitable as our current dairy industry?
Yeah, I think Fonterra put up its milk price by another 50 cents today. So dairy is profitable because it externalizes a lot of its costs onto the environment and people. We've seen in places like Canterbury, where I'm based, huge increase in water take both from the aquifers and rivers. So that means lower flows, less recreational enjoyment. And it's also meant increased nitrate. So then there's a health risk of increased colorectal cancer for people from higher nitrate levels above the World Health Organization standard. Um, and and so that cost is not borne by the industry, which is why it is profitable. So if they had to pay for the water they're using and preventing other people from using, and nature from using, because if you take water out of rivers, there's less for the fish and the wildlife, they wouldn't be as profitable. So we need a much better system of environmental accounting, which puts those costs back on the industry. But I think there's enormous innovation in the agricultural sector, and we are seeing now a lot more development with merino, using the keratin in the wool to create a plastic, using, and the story of icebreaker, consumers are interested in how the wool is grown. They're prepared to pay a premium if they know it's sustainable, if it can be tracked, and icebreaker's done that. Things like hemp, really good fibre, and one that we should be using again to create ropes rather than using plastic ropes for things like mussel farming and then getting more plastic in the ocean. But we need a system which encourages that and which recognises the costs of things that are profitable, like dairying, by having a commercial charge for water and by continuing to have more funding for innovation in the agricultural space. And I think a lot of farmers, there are groups like Future Farmers, thinking about how farming can be done so it's more sensitive to its environmental impacts, seeks to reduce those and seeks to work in a climate where there's going to be more drought on the east coast of the South Island. So looking at different crops like quinoa, lentils, oats, increase in growing oats for oat milk. Government's invested in a processing facility, so we can more easily have oat milk here in New Zealand without having to be processed offshore. So, and we are seeing more farmers recognise their environmental impacts and doing things like riparian planting, experimenting with a mixed pasture sward, doing more spelling of pasture, but there's still a huge amount of change that's needed. And this is where politics makes a difference, because National and ACT are proposing to allow live exports again, which Labor and the Greens banned this term. So we want good animal welfare standards as well, because consumers in Europe, where one of our big markets, want to know how things are produced that they're going to be eating. And we need to be able to tell that sustainability story with integrity.
Yeah, that's a lot of good points, I guess. And yeah, if we're doing live exports, then you're going to lose the revenue because customers don't want their exports to be like that.
There's a very small amount of value that is obtained by a small number of people, whereas it's jeopardizing our whole brand. If we want to build on a clean green brand, we need to actually deliver on that, both in terms of the way we look after the environment and the way we treat animals.
Yeah, that's true. So what's some of your biggest takeaways that your career in biodiversity and environmental spaces has taught you so far?
Still learning, always learning.
Yeah.
And there's always more that we can do. And lots of people I think it is just being inspired in the biodiversity space in the last 5 to 10 years. A lot more people, particularly with predator free, out doing predator control, trapping, weed control, things like old man's beard, some of the vines, recognizing that they can help nature in their backyard or in their community. And it's been that massive increase in people getting involved, which not just leaving it to Papa Atawhai Doc, that's been inspiring. And it's the power of working with others. Doing things by yourself, you don't get very much done. But if you work with others, you can achieve an awful lot.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very sweet. Just to finish the interview off, what have been some of your most memorable or funny moments in your political career thus far?
There's lots. I think memorable things like School Strike for Climate and the mass mobilisation of young people demanding that we protect their future and really calling politicians to account and inspiring the Greens that the course we're on in advocating for more change and making change in the climate space is the right one. I was cleaning out my office today and I found a 2006 policy booklet of things the Green Party wanted to do to stop the climate heating up. So we've been on this for a long time. And other memorable moments, being in, and I referred to this in my valedictory, being in Raukumara forest and just seeing the damage that deer had done. They had just completely debarked the trees. And I hadn't been aware of, I've obviously been in lots of forests where there's ferns and horapito in the understory because they're less palatable. And so all the palatable plants have been eaten out. But I'd never seen trees completely debarked before, up to deer browse height. And the commitment then to help Ngāti Porou and Te Whanau Panui fund the forest restoration with Doc. Was lucky enough to go to the Antipodes with the Navy after the $1 Million Mouse eradication program had happened to check whether all the mice had gone, and seeing Antipodes parakeets, which are little green parakeets. They're a ground bird there because there aren't any feral cats, possums, stoats there, mustelids, so they can stay on the ground. And just thinking that was like Aotearoa was once like, when you had a lot of these ground birds which were completely fearless of people. Yeah, and then also seeing the carcasses of some of the Antipodean albatross where one of the parent birds had been killed at sea. And for an albatross chick to grow to maturity, it needs to be fed by both parents. They alternate. One's on the nest looking after the chick, and one's out at sea feeding, comes back, feeds the chick. So if one of them is killed on a fishing long line, then the other parent, despite everything that it does, cannot feed the chick enough for it to survive. So seeing the bones of these birds that hadn't been able to reach adulthood and fledge, yeah, that just again underlined how much more we have to do to reduce the impacts of fishing. That's a bit despondent. So, and it's been where new legislation has passed, getting the Crown Pastoral Lands Bill through, which I introduced, did the policy work on, and then it was passed when Damien was minister. And so changing the way the high country's managed and ending tenure review. Yeah, there's lots of little things too that you sort of get reminded about. So, but it's only by working with others. So I think the most memorable things are also with things like petitions, where people present a petition to Parliament, which is one of the oldest of our democratic processes. People used to petition the King once upon a time in England. So now people petition Parliament, and then the Select Committee can hear from the petitioner and hear from other organisations with an interest. And then it will hear from government agencies, and then it considers the issue and makes a recommendation, and then government has to report back on whether it agrees with that recommendation. So we had one on feral cats, which a woman, Erica, had started. Roland's, and we got, at the end of that whole process, all of the parties agreed that there should be national cat management legislation, because cats, like deer, are another big threat to our Indigenous species, particularly feral cats. And so there was agreement across all the parties that we need national cat management legislation. We have, which has microchipping and neutering of cats that aren't required for breeding. And that would reduce the stray cat population and would help ensure that every cat is a wanted cat. So it's things like the parliamentary process working, people being able to bring the issues they care about to the attention of the parliament, having all the MPs from the different parties consider it in a measured way, getting more information in, and then coming out with a recommendation for change, which I hope in the next parliament somebody will take up and pursue, because yeah, we've got millions of feral cats and their populations get increased by the stray cat population. So if we can ensure that every cat's a loved cat, then that helps. And they also spread toxoplasmosis. So that's really bad for people and for sheep.
Mm. Well, you've got so much knowledge. I can imagine that the Greens Party and Parliament is going to be at a real loss without having you there in the next term. Hopefully the knowledge does get passed on so people can work on all the great initiatives that you've started.
I feel like you'll be making sure that happens.
I think, no, but having been there, like Jan, both of us there for 12 years, it's time to let others have a go, and you can work in many ways, and be very happy going back to working with community organisations and others. But thank you, Harita, for that comment. And yeah, others will work in different ways as well. So yeah.
Mm. So I guess you're ending your parliament career here, but there's probably still so much more you want to do. So what type of plans do you have from your, I'd like to say parliament retirement, but not retirement?
I want to have the summer off. I haven't done very much tramping. I do a lot of interacting with people, meetings, with keyboards as an MP, and have not got out and gone tramping. So I'm very unfit. So I would like to get out and get into nature a bit over the summer, into the sea a bit more, learn to surf. I love body surfing. Then we'll see. There are so many nature issues, climate issues, whether it's freshwater waste, biodiversity, that need a hand. So it's sort of working out where I can use my skills and help. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll definitely be keeping busy. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we know you've got a busy week with helping with campaigning for the rest of the election period. So it really means a lot that you were able to join us today. Yeah, and all the best with the next week, and all the best for your retirement from Parliament, and hopefully some well-deserved rest and recovery as well.
Kia ora koroa. Thank you, Harita. Thank you, Hayley. Great that you're doing these interviews. Thank you. Kia ora.
Thank you.